Are Waqf funds still being set up today, or are people, wealthy families or governments, gifting their movable assets into existing Waqf funds?
That's an interesting question. It's just say, okay, where do I start? Do I start in history or do I look at in the contemporary cases? Because if something's going to last in perpetuity, then you expect that something that was established 8th, 9th, 10th century, then probably it's going to exist.
Hello everyone, welcome back to another episode of The Way of Wealth with myself, Bajesh, and my co-host Mohammed. And we have a brand new guest for you, Dr. Shah. Welcome. He is our head of ADL research. He's a very smart man, as you can tell. His name starts with doctor. Why don't you tell us a little bit more about yourself?
I'm a doctor. Yeah, just call me Shah, it's easy for everyone.
He's not a proper doctor.
Huh?
He's not a proper doctor.
Yeah, I'm a real doctor, come on.
He's got the PhD.
Yeah, I worked hard for it. You ever seen Friends? Versus Dr. Geller.
Brilliant.
Have you seen that? Yeah. Head of research for ADL research. Got my PhD from the School of Advanced Studies, which is part of the University of London. And I got it in theology and philosophy, and my main focus of my research is, I'm going to scare everybody here, Islamic family law in Britain. So I was delving quite deep into it. So my whole interest is looking at the Islamic epistemologies, as we're going to talk about it, of the religious leaders in Britain. Right. And how they struggle to reconcile with tradition, with the lived realities of Muslims living in Britain.
What is epistemology?
To put it bluntly, it just means the study of knowledge, how they accumulate knowledge, the sources, and how it influences the thinking of the individual. So in the case I was looking at the Islamic scholars and their epistemological background, their education, their pedagogy, their schooling, how that shapes their way of thinking and how they apply it in Britain and some of the challenges that they face with that.
Fascinating. Cool. And Shah and Mo, you've both co-authored a paper recently about Waqf funds. Yeah. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Waqf, to put it in a nutshell, it means an endowment for philanthropic causes. So just to keep it easy for everyone, I'll use Waqf, but essentially I'll probably just shift between languages. It's just a lot more easy for English-speaking audiences. So Waqf is just dedicating assets into a trust for a charitable cause. The term Waqf itself means to suspend or to stop. And the whole idea of it is where an individual wants to dedicate an endowment for the sake of God. The term is called fi sabilillah. And there's another term for it, it's also called hubs, but I'll come back to that later. And the whole idea of an endowment is about donating to charity for what's called philanthropic cause. And it all stems from, quite interestingly, not from the Quran itself, and not directly from the traditions of the Prophet Muhammad, which Muslims find that that is the second most important source for living life as a devout Muslim. But it comes from a lot of the set examples from Muhammad himself, his companions, and from there, this is where the idea of donating for social welfare stems from. It comes from the Prophet Muhammad, where when he migrated from Mecca to Medina, the first thing he did when he entered the city of Medina is that he wanted to establish a mosque. So then he let the camel roam where it went, and then it stopped in a property of two orphans, Sahal and Sahel, and then wanted to dedicate the property to the Prophet Muhammad to say that, okay, you can build the mosque. And then he says, no, I would rather buy the property and then build a mosque for the benefit of society. So from there, it stems from this point where you've got to be quite judicious when you establish an endowment. Rather than taking it from orphans, you pay for it.
I see.
And then this sort of spirit, this philanthropic spirit, continued down through the community. Is that you got his companion, Umar Khattab, where he received a large amount of land from Khyber. And the plantation, that date plantations there was very, very fertile. And then Umar says, well, I want to dedicate this to the Muslim community. And then the Prophet Muhammad says, don't do that. Look after the farm, and its yields, the profits that you get from the yields, donate that into charity.
Okay.
So this whole point about having an immovable asset, that you cultivate it, and then the profits you receive from that, that is dedicated to a charitable cause.
Right. Okay.
And then that continued down with other companions of Muhammad, with Umar, where he had a watering well.
Right.
Is very yielding quite a lot of water. And he
Is
said,
that
well,
Uthman, isn't it?
Uthman ibn Affan.
Yeah,
Uthman
yeah.
ibn Affan.
Yeah.
And then he dedicated that for a waqf.
Yeah.
So essentially it's about dedicating an endowment,
Yeah.
either largely immovable assets,
Yeah.
for a philanthropic cause for the benefit of society. And the whole point with a waqf is supposed to last for in perpetuity.
Interesting. Okay.
So the minute you establish it, it's supposed to continue through the generations. And that's where the main contention of debate happens between the scholars of Islamic law, and that's where a lot of the confusion comes in. But just from that brief overview, you find that it's more in the spirit of charity. That's where the idea of waqf was established.
Okay.
And then in the following centuries, this is where the scholars of Islamic law, they decided to establish it as an institution as the Muslim empire expanded. They found that there were people who wanted to dedicate to charity.
Yeah.
They wanted to give these land, buildings and infrastructure for this charitable cause. So they had to establish some sort of like endowment system.
To pass that on.
Yeah,
essentially.
to manage it and mediate in it.
Just a question on that, because I know you just mentioned that Waqf funds are supposed to last in perpetuity.
In perpetuity.
Thank you.
Forever.
They're supposed to last forever. Are Waqf funds still being set up today, or are people, wealthy families or governments, gifting their immovable assets into existing Waqf funds?
That's an interesting question. Let's just say, okay, where do I start? Do I start in history, or do I look at in the contemporary cases? Because if something's going to last in perpetuity, then you'd expect that something that was established the 8th, 9th, 10th century, then probably it's going to exist to this day and age.
Yeah.
And this whole point goes into another topic about whether an endowment, Islamic endowment, can be terminated, which it can. But then there's difference of opinions on this point.
Right.
Shah, the Waqf is basically a charity, right? Or not? Like, a UK charity can effectively be in perpetuity forever.
Well, this comes down to
There's
my...
no term limit.
Yeah, this comes down to my research, because I've been at it for like a year.
Yeah.
Because I was quite fascinated to understand how Islamic finance works. I went to do Islamic family law, and I was there for like 10 years just studying all the terminologies, all the mechanisms, and also with the theories of Islamic law. Because then I've got a good feel of it. And then I said, okay, let me see how this Islamic finance works. And the first thing I say, okay, let's look at Islamic endowments.
Yep.
Because I'm a social entrepreneur.
No, brilliant. Yeah, no doubt.
But the one thing they say that all Islamic endowments, waqf, is charity, sadaqah. Just say sadaqah. But not all charities are waqf. So you've got different forms. So you have different forms of charity within Islam.
Yep, correct.
So you have the conventional, we've got zakat, which is the compulsory obligatory charity, where Muslims are mandated to contribute 2.5% of their wealth.
Correct.
But this is where the difference of opinions comes in about, well, are they movable assets? Are they immovable assets? This is where the debates come in. So zakat is the mandatory charity. Then you've got sadaqah, which is the it's called voluntary charity.
Yep.
But then you also have the fitrah, which is like fitrana was Eid recently.
Yeah.
So you donate a charitable donation at the end of the Eid prayer.
Yeah.
Then you also got hiba, which is basically a gift where you consolidate relationships between a husband and wife or with friends. You've got Qarda Hasan. There's different forms of charity.
Yeah.
Waqf is its own form of charity. Is that something that the donor or the founder, this is another debate that I've been exploring, which I'll go into detail later, where the donor, founder, what would you prefer, donor or founder?
Both of them, I think, is fine. But I think the point that I was trying to allude to, so let's say that the intention
Yeah.
of making that charitable distribution is fundamentally important. So if you have a donor,
Yeah.
right, and the donor have donated, let's say, 100 grand to
Yeah.
a charity,
Yeah.
okay, he's effectively wanting that 100 grand to be used for a philanthropic cause
Yeah.
for as long as that 100 grand starts.
Yeah.
Lasts.
Yeah.
Okay. But I appreciate, because we're dealing with 100 grand, okay, and 100 grand, we're talking about cash here, okay. If that's not invested, it's just going to be whittled away on that particular philanthropic cause, okay. But by virtue of construct, okay, if my intention is philanthropic from day one and I've put it into a UK charity, that charity, as far as I've understood, okay, it's effectively a waqf that I've set up.
This is the point where you're talking about cash investments for an endowment.
Yeah.
This is where there's a huge debate
Yeah, correct.
within Islamic laws of finance about what is the nature of the endowment. Is it an immovable asset?
Yep.
Or is it a movable asset? Cash falls into the movable category,
Yeah,
doesn't
correct.
it?
But let's say principally it doesn't matter, all right? Because we're aware that we've had a lot of debates in this space, and then during the Ottoman period, towards the end of it, they've accepted cash endowments into a waqf. Let's put that debate to one side. But a waqf, could that essentially be a UK charity? Where is the distinction between them both?
But this is where there is a distinction between the type of waqf that could be established. One
Yep.
is the charitable waqf,
Yep.
waqf khairi,
Yep.
and one is the family waqf, which is
Yeah.
waqf ahli, and this is how it's been divided, where you make an endowment for a philanthropic cause.
Yep.
But this is where the terms of the contract becomes very, very crucial, which I'll come to that. Just put that pin on it.
All right, cool.
But then you got family waqf, which by all definitions is a trust.
Yes.
It is essentially a trust.
Yep.
It's just that the line's been blurred between the family waqf and the charitable waqf. And this is where a lot of people started to circumvent a lot of the tax and charitable contributions they made within Muslim societies, which can be pretty much a hard reality check for a lot of Muslims to accept that. But this is where my research and future papers that I'll be publishing will be covering that.
Yep.
It's hard to distinguish it whether it can be a charity because there's 4 components of a waqf.
Okay.
Okay, one is the donor, the waqif.
Yep.
He's the one that dedicates what's called the assets.
Yep.
Okay. And the second is the assets himself, which is the mawquf, and that's the nature of the assets. But this asset needs to last in perpetuity.
Yeah.
Now, oftentimes they say that a building can last forever.
Yep.
In theory. Infrastructure,
Yep.
these immovable assets, they are seen by the classic scholars as these items will last forever.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then you've got the beneficiaries.
Yep.
That's a third component. That's quite crucial as well.
Yep.
Who the assets are going to be benefiting. Will it be benefiting society or will it be benefiting certain individuals?
Okay, so you can have a class beneficiary or a cause as well.
Yeah, but the fourth and most important is the terms and conditions, the sigar, the terms and conditions of the contract.
Okay.
That is probably the most important because that's set down by, this is why I use the term founder rather than donor, because anyone can donate into it, but the terms and conditions is defined by the founder of the endowment.
Brilliant.
And this is the point where a lot of the scholars found it quite difficult, is where the founder establishes terms and conditions, but these terms and conditions between the founder and God.
Yeah.
And this is where a lot of the scholars of Islamic law found it quite difficult to say that we cannot intervene in this contract. This is between the man or a woman. A lot of the waqfs were established by women, to be quite honest.
Yeah.
It's between the founder and God.
Yeah.
And we have to honor that.
Yeah.
And this is where there's difference of opinions to say, well, can we interject? And there are many different opinions about points where we can actually intervene.
Yeah.
I've got a question about the underlying finances to a charity. So when you set up a trust in the UK, one of the trustee duties is that the trustees have to look after the underlying investment.
Correct, yeah.
Essentially, they have to invest the money.
Yeah.
Now, I'm not sure how this applies to international trusts,
Yeah.
but do charities in the UK, do they have to invest their money to essentially look after the money to adhere to their responsibilities as a trustee?
Yeah, no.
And then similarly in Waqf,
Yeah.
if there's no immovable property,
Yeah.
so no property or land, we've got cash instead.
I mean,
So,
Do they have?
this topic in itself, it could be like 2-3 podcasts, because the one thing that I found is there's a lot of parallels between Western British models of trust
Yeah.
and the Waqf itself. It seems that there seems to be a lot of overlaps in it.
Yeah.
We talked about there's a trustee involved.
Yes.
One of the points about what the founder of a Waqf can do is someone who can manage the endowment.
Mm-hmm.
And they have different categories of trustees. One is you've got the Mutawalli, which is standard, pretty much the manager or the trustee of the endowment who looks after daily administrative routines, paying salaries and etc. Another one is a supervisor, which is the Nazir, who makes sure that the manager and the trustee is looking after the trust.
Yeah.
And the third one is a Qayyum, which is the caretaker. So you've got different categories, roles
Okay,
within
so
the main.
different. Yeah.
So there's different roles.
Each with different
Yeah.
responsibilities.
but Shah, all of those roles evolved over time, okay, depending on the situation at hand, the unique situations facing that particular cause,
Yeah.
what the donor was trying to achieve,
Yeah.
okay. Effectively, these are new administrative roles. In exactly the same way, when it comes to a UK trust, or a UK trust or a UK charitable trust, you're going to have different functions appearing. Same way with any organization, right? When we first set up the business, it was only one of us, then two of us. Then we've got more than 10 people now involved in the business. So you've got these unique roles that end up needing to provide a particular type of service.
Yeah.
Charities in of themselves, UK charities, they're not necessarily mandated to invest all of that money. Even with a Waqf, okay, the Waqf administrators, the Waqf managers here, they're not necessarily mandated to invest the money. However, in our research, there is a enormous emphasis on the preservation of capital, so that trust or that Waqf can last forever. Okay. What leads on from that is, what if it doesn't last forever? How can anything last forever? I mean, if we were to move slightly into theology here, only God is infinite, right? Okay, so how can then we mandate that the underlying trust assets also need to be infinite?
Yeah, this is a quandary that the scholars of Islamic law had to contend with, to say that only God lasts in perpetuity. He's there forever. You can't say the same thing with land, building or infrastructure. But this is where you say that it's always in a state of evolution. Take for example, I mentioned that you have a supervisory role as one of the trustees. Now, it came to a point that the best supervisor would be the courts.
Yeah.
They would say that, okay, you got the trustee and the manager who's taking care of this thing.
Yeah.
And normally the donor, founder, would nominate a supervisor.
Yeah.
But often was the case they wouldn't nominate a supervisor, and then they say the courts will come and say, okay, we'll be the supervisor to make sure he follows all the rulings of Islamic law or state law. So it's always developing.
Makes complete sense.
The problem came in is that they were very, very reluctant to accommodate cash because that's a movable asset and it's fungible. This is why they were always saying that, well, buildings, they last for sometimes. You can invest in it, you can repair it. Cash.
But they lose value as well.
But this is the point where they say that when you do have a building, you rent it out, and it's called the rent, the profits you get from it, it's reinvested to charity.
But that's assuming you can rent the building out.
in
Yeah.
argument's sake, you have a
Yeah.
building, you rent it
Correct.
out. The first thing is that the profits
Yeah.
gained, the first thing you do, you repair those buildings. And what's left over, that's what you distribute to the beneficiaries.
Yeah.
So it's always a case about maintaining these assets,
Yeah.
which is why they started saying that, the scholars started saying, well, you can take fixtures and fittings within the immovable assets,
Yep.
you can sell them to repair the larger building as well.
Yep.
You could donate a mosque to as an endowment, but the
Yeah.
surrounding area, like the farmland or the shops or wherever, they could be sold to repair the focus, the central endowment, which is the
Okay.
mosque.
The
yeah.
central object. Okay.
Gradually, over time, they found that it's unfeasible to be selling these large immovable, what's called properties like cutlery, books. They say that they start accommodating in cash.
Yeah.
This is where the huge ruckus came in during the 15th century. Say that we can't use cash because there's often they demonize cash because at that point cash was quite new
Yeah.
within society. And then the older generation to say that we cannot be accommodating cash. Well, the younger generation was saying that, well, there's a lot more utility we can do with cash.
Yeah.
We can use it to maintain it.
Yeah.
So it's always, it's the same story again and again, is that when there's new technologies that emerge, the older generations are kind of reluctant
totally.
to accommodate it.
What do current Waqf funds do these days?
Yeah.
Will they hold immovable property and cash to facilitate purchasing more movable property? Will they hold investments that comply with Sharia law?
This is where the debate seems to be, there seem to be different debates happening in different parts of the world, because I was focused a lot more within the Middle East, a lot of the sources from the Middle East, because it seems to be that endowments seem to be quite an established institution there. And they're often the case say that this is where you do cash investments of endowments.
Yeah.
The debate is happening there to say that we need to invest in these funds for philanthropic causes, charitable causes.
Yeah.
In my research, I still feel as though they're still trying to reconcile tradition with the contemporary age a lot,
Okay.
because technology and especially when you got, where does cryptocurrency fit within endowments? That's quite a need.
It's too risky.
That's too risky.
Maybe a very small percentage of the underlying,
That's true. I think
the underlying asset.
Yeah, correct. That's if we were going to the investment allocation, right? They're going to be new emerging debates, especially if you. That has happened throughout the ages.
Yeah.
There's going to be reformers, those people who want to move ahead, and there's going to be those who want to be that much more conservative because they're concerned about the reform. I think that debate is actually very important,
Yeah.
and it's a necessary debate because it's only when you have a well-natured debate between these two parties, okay, or these two arguments, fair debates, each party can actually listen to one another and then think, do you know what, we need to find a middle way where we can navigate without going way too ahead, which could actually compromise the overall integrity of that particular society, community, that particular cause. I think in the past, all right, we didn't have a welfare state, okay? The notion of a welfare state is relatively quite new. I'm talking about generally, okay? Yes, early Islamic societies, they did have a welfare state, but very rudimentary in contrast to what we have today. Okay, we don't realize how lucky we are that we have the NHS. We don't realize how lucky we are. We have those people who cannot afford to meet their needs, okay? We have the government who can actually step in. We have a state welfare system throughout all sections of society. These are novel concepts, okay? And not only novel concepts, but there's
Novel in the sense that, because the NHS was formed back in 100 years ago, right?
Correct.
Roughly.
Yeah.
And then when did the welfare state expand to include all, state pension, state benefits, universal credit?
So even from them, right? Because the underlying funding principles of that, from what I recall, it all stemmed from Keynesian economics.
Okay.
Okay. And having said that, all right, we had a manner of creating liquidity that will allow economic growth that will then fund all of these enterprises.
Right.
That can fund the welfare state. But what has happened over the last 20, 30 years or so, we've had a lot of things being stripped away. Okay, which is a debate in of itself as to why that is happening.
Sure.
Okay, and that definitely relates to a lack of a genuine real economy.
Right.
And this is and we'll get into let's say what that real economy is, right? Because if we're living in a society where we're perpetually creating new debt, right, and our goal is purely to only service that debt, and we're not dealing with the capital, there's going to be systematic issues that will affect the underlying society.
The NHS is quite a good example that you picked up on because, like you said, it started 100 years ago. I would say I'm quite a novice to understanding the organisational structure of the NHS, but what we can see right now is that we're finding that the NHS cuts is hitting the service quite hard. You go to the hospitals, you find doctors there completely exhausted and nurses exhausted.
Yeah.
It's quite interesting to look at that model about how the Waqf system was established. Its purpose was established is to provide a social service. Its intention was to provide a social service, but there was no monitoring mechanism to make sure how do you maintain that. The NHS, you have to maintain it. If you don't maintain it, it's going to start disintegrating, fragmenting, which is what we all suffer. Now, what I found with the intention of Waqf was to provide a social benefit. You make an endowment for the sake of God, provide a social benefit, but you need to maintain that. And it was also the case that the administrative structures, the system itself, the Waqf system, that required to be maintained. The problem came in is that when it became so convoluted, is that no one knows where do you start and where do you begin. Like one case people often make is that the introduction of family Waqf, which is essentially a trust, that complicated the debate because they say that charity begins at home. There is a prophetic tradition from Muhammad that says that you look after your family first before you start looking after your society. So a lot of people took that and said, well, we're supposed to donate within our families.
Right.
And there was often a case, there was this debate during the time of Usman, where he said that zakat is applied to immovable assets, but things like the currency, like dirhams and dinars, they cannot be charged zakat. So then they say, well, there's no zakat on funds, and then it can establish as an endowment. So a lot of families, especially elite families, they circumvented the mandatory tax, say zakat, to say that, well, we're giving this charity to something else. So
effectively, Waqf become a tax evasion tool.
Essentially, it became a tax evasion tool. And this is where the other debate came in, where you've got within the Sunni traditions, there's 4 popular schools. In reality, there's many schools, but what continued perpetually, if I can use that word, since the 9th, 10th century, are these 4 interpretations of law. So they take the Quran and they take the prophetic traditions and they have their own ways of interpreting it. So those that followed by South Asia, the Hanafi traditions, they take more of an inductive approach. They look at what's going on in society and then go back to the sources and say, okay, what do the texts have to say that? I'm glossing over quite a lot, but just get the bread and butter of it, you'll get it. And then in Saudi Arabia, it's more deductive. They take the rules from the Quran and the prophetic traditions and then they apply that to society. So already you can see 2 different approaches. And then you got in North Africa, they follow the Maliki tradition, so their more emphasis is on the last 10 years of the Prophet's what's called mission in Medina. So they have a whole different approach because Medina, there was an established community. So they follow that model. And then you have the Shafi traditions, which is far more pedantic in terms of applying the theory of Islamic law. So there's all these different interpretations. So no doubt they're going to interpret the Waqf institutions in their own ways.
Thank you for watching and tune in for our next video for part 2.